Rishi Narang is the co-founder and CEO of an accelerator called Pioneer. And the really unique thing is that his accelerator, any person with an idea can join from day zero and get feedback from other founders, and the best ideas get selected to get an investment. Rishi has been before in product and engineering at AngelList. He has been run a managing partner at Dorm Room Fund. So he's been around both building products, investing, and now helping other founders succeed. And his talk is going to share about the technical founders manual from seed to early stage investment. Please welcome Rishi on stage. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Hey everyone, I'm Rishi. Very excited to be here. Thanks, Vlad, Mihai, and the rest of the team. So today's talk is going to be on operational excellence for technical founders. Now, it's not a topic that I think gets talked about quite enough. At Pioneer, we've been investing in very, very early founders for several years, and I'm a strong believer. Our whole team is full of strong believers that technical founders can also be world-class operators. So a little bit about Pioneer just to start. We have kind of two parts. One is the software. We have a platform, a community of founders all around the world who are submitting progress updates every week, getting feedback from other founders, and basically every week or two we take the top founders from that community, from that competition, and we invest in them. We give them 20K, put them through an 8-week accelerator program, and we have founders that we funded in over 50 countries. Don't have anyone from Romania yet, so if you are working on a company, you should definitely apply. And first, I want to reiterate that there is obviously a ton of excellent advice on getting started when you're in the early days of building a company. You have YC Startup School essays from greats like Paul Graham, Fred Wilson, even sort of newer sources like Lenny Rachitsky's excellent collection on product advice. Of course, there are tons of great books. You have your armchair advice from Dropbox. There's certainly kind of advice everywhere that you need to find it. And so today, we're going to be focusing, again, on operational excellence, which is more about questions like, how do I find and commit to an idea? How should I think about the role of a non-technical founder? How do I manage my time? How do I prioritize? All things that I think are very important and are actually not that hard to do well, but you have to pause and kind of think about them. So ultimately, what makes a great technical founder? Now, this isn't exactly a field manual. The title's a little bit misleading, and the reason I want to emphasize this is because a lot of great companies don't necessarily have a very linear path. Actually, most don't have a very linear path. So I want to pick Intercom as an example. Certainly, Slack is a great example of a company that people always talk about. Oh, they started in gaming, then they had this kind of app that they built internally, and that spun out into its own separate company that became Slack. Intercom actually has a very similar, less talked about, quite interesting story. So right now, Intercom is a multi-billion-dollar company. It is a B2B SaaS product for companies to build better software for their customers. You've all probably seen it before. You're on a website, a little message bubble pops up. It's like, hey, I'm Karen, how can I help you? That's Intercom. And that company started as exception tracking for Ruby on Rails. There's this team of 4 founders based in Dublin. They were a web consultancy, kind of using the income to build their side projects. And one of those side projects was Exceptional. And while they were building Exceptional, they had downtime quite often themselves, and one of the features that they built was a little message notification that you can see there, right up on the screen. And the idea behind that was kind of notifying users when there was a problem and saying, hey, sorry. And they actually got a lot of really positive reactions to that little feature, and it made them kind of question, well, should we be building something along those lines? So in about 2010, 2011, they sold Exceptional and wrote their first lines of code for what would eventually be Intercom, which is now, of course, a multi-billion-dollar company. So we're going to refer back to this story a little bit throughout the rest of the talk, but I want to start there to kind of emphasize that obviously this is not as simple as 3 easy steps to raising a seed round. Unlike Elon, I think many of you have probably seen this blog post that he wrote back in 2006 where he kind of outlined over the next 15 years, hey, here's kind of the master plan. We're going to start with a really expensive car. We're going to use the revenue from that to build kind of a mid-market car. And it's like scarily accurate if you look at that and read it today. Most people, actually the vast majority, are not going to have kind of that predictable path. So let's start with the goal. The goal is to raise a seed round. And unfortunately, it's like very difficult to figure out nowadays how to raise a seed round. You have like people, these stories that you read online where people are raising at these crazy valuations pre-product, happening a lot, especially you'll read like Web3 companies are raising at kind of these insane valuations. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that. It is just sort of a matter of building the case for how do you have a reasonable shot at finding product market fit. That's kind of the criteria for raising a seed round. And there are a few ways of demonstrating that you have a reasonable shot. Founder backgrounds, kind of a case that you have a really big problem in a really big market, traction, and then derivative, which gets talked about less. That's how quickly is your team moving? Are you kind of, even if your numbers are unimpressive, has the idea kind of evolved a lot in a way that displays that you actually really know what you're doing and you'll figure out what the real problem is that you need to eventually solve? Obviously, the best evidence for this is revenue and active users, but short of that, there are a few things that you can do that can help you kind of display that derivative, whatever it is that you're trying to show. And so there are 4 things that we'll focus on for the rest of this talk. Talking to users, building product, completing your founding team, and polishing your idea. Now, to start, we're going to talk about your ideal environment. Technical founders, I being one myself, you'll find often actually start in environments that are great for engineering, but not necessarily for building great companies. For example, you go to hackathons, and hackathons can be sort of a great starting point, but having gone through like an engineering degree myself, I found myself often surrounded by people who are working on really interesting tech, but not necessarily oriented towards, for example, solving a problem that could eventually become a great company. And so it's, again, an excellent starting point, but not necessarily how you're going to build a great company. Kieran, one of the founders of Intercom, has this great quote. Back in the early days of building Intercom, they sold Exceptional, and his second time in San Francisco, he was sort of amazed by how ambitious Americans were, and this was back in 2011. And he has this hilarious quote where he says to his co-founder, dude, if we nail this, this could be a $10 million company, which is like absolutely outrageous. I think all of us here know that when if you have dreams to build a great company, it could be much bigger than that, and that was him being ambitious. He goes on to eventually say, maybe it'll be 100 million a couple months later. But then eventually he discovers it could actually be much, much bigger than that. So it's important to kind of recognize that the environment that you're in can do a lot for you. It'll energize you, it'll raise your ambitions, and it'll ultimately make you more successful. There are studies that show that if you're in certain neighborhoods, you're more likely to get diabetes, you're more likely to be obese. If you're surrounded by runners, you're more likely to run. That same principle applies to being a founder as well. If you're surrounded by great founders, you will pick up on their habits. And so how do you do that? Well, there's online communities and there's physical communities. Online, there's Twitter, there's Pioneer, something that we take a lot of pride in, is building a great community of typically technical founders. There's obviously physical communities, universities, SF, London, Singapore, conferences like Techsylvania. Surround yourself with great founders and kind of observe them and experiment with what they do. Some of our founders, for example, find a lot of success in sending weekly update emails or bi-weekly emails to mentors, investors, even just friends who don't even know what they're building, because it motivates you, it keeps you accountable. And you can ditch the idea after a week, but experimenting is kind of a very important concept that you should kind of apply to every aspect of what you're building, not necessarily just your A/B tests. So the idea, I was actually practicing this talk last week, and someone was like, wait, shouldn't idea come before environment? The answer is actually probably not. A lot of the times, being in the right environment will help you land on the right idea. So to start, before focusing on technical founders, just the common, real quick idea finding advice. There's kind of 4 to 5 common pieces of advice that are very important. Obviously, focus on problems, not solutions. Keep iterating. Put yourself in the right environment. And then once you're comparing ideas, kind of evaluate them on how big they could be, how painful the specific problem is, whether you in particular fit with the market that you're building in, and ultimately what makes your angle unique. Now, technical founders, I find, often have sort of two buckets where they'll typically kind of fall into a trap. Number one is a product or technology in search of a use case. This is excellent for research, for improving a technology, and that's why I think me and many other engineers fall into this trap of you keep iterating, you kind of figure out how to make this technology even more fun and interesting and potentially useful, but that has a very long time horizon. It's ultimately bad for finding a big idea. I think an example of this is when iOS first came out with these cool augmented reality tools, a lot of engineers started experimenting with it and starting companies and saying these are going to be huge companies because of these really cool tools. Nowadays, actually, I think Pokemon Go is probably the main exception to this, and even that's like gaming, so that's a little bit of a different analogy, but for the most part, AR, where you see it nowadays, is just Snapchat, TikTok, Instagram, it's already big companies. Like, not that many new startups came out of, not many huge startups, I should say, came out of that. And so it's important to start with specific problems. The other kind of big bucket is difficult markets. A lot of engineers, I think one of the first apps that I built for fun was sort of education related. Now it's like, it'll be great. Teachers and students will use it in classrooms. Class Dojo is a great example of this. They're a super successful product that students and teachers are both very engaged with, but like revenue is not incredible. It's just a difficult market to be in, and it's one that many people will start in and then eventually move out of. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't work in education, of course. It just means you should understand what the angle is that you will take that will make you more successful than the other attempts, and that is typically not an engineering problem. It's a regulatory, it's a sales, it's some other kind of problem. So the solution for this is polish, but applied in the right places. So polishing your idea is very important. That can be a dangerous concept if you're kind of over-polishing specific features that you're building, polishing your product a little bit too much. Obviously, down the road, you have to do that, but in the early days, it really only matters in one place in particular, and that is your idea. And you have to polish your idea by talking to users. And depending on your strengths, depending on your personality, it may be hard to be successful at this. So that takes us to kind of our next topic, which is what a complete founding team looks like. At Pioneer, we've funded a lot of solo founders, and so I'm not here to say you need to find a co-founder, but you should think about what a great founding team looks like, and if you can do that on your own, or if you need to kind of complement yourself with other people. There are a few things that all great founding teams have in common. They execute quickly and mostly correctly. It's fine to make mistakes. They understand their users, and they attract talented teammates. There's obviously company-specific skills, like if you're building a consumer product, product design might matter in specific use cases if you're building, especially in the early days, obviously it matters kind of everywhere over time. And then you have your personal needs. Is it going to help you kind of stay accountable? Are you going to be motivated? Is it going to help you with creativity? And you should really introspect and think about whether you need these, whether you need a co-founder to help you on kind of all of these elements as well. So day-to-day execution. The best early-stage technical teams set the pace for incredibly productive the best early-stage technical founders set the pace for incredibly productive teams. And there are kind of a few ways that they do that. Number one is that they're extremely productive, especially in the early days when, as a technical founder, you're doing most of the building yourself. They make quick decisions, and they're excellent technical and non-technical communicators. So let's start with productivity. I'm going to go kind of through a couple examples of a calendar that I think a lot of people have made this mistake. So you're going to look at this calendar, and I think most people are going to be like, well, that's obviously bad. I have no time to get work done. All my meetings are spread throughout the week. So here's kind of improvement number one that a lot of people will make. Okay, great. I have my large focused work blocks. I have my one-on-ones, my investor meetings, my candidate calls, all in large clumps. And that way I have plenty of time to schedule, to kind of do all the focused work that I need to do. There's another less common but extremely important improvement you can make to this as a technical founder, which is to group actually your types of calls. I've talked to a number of technical founders who said, I used to do that. I used to kind of have engineering meeting and then investor meeting and then back to an engineering meeting. And I got my focused work done, but I was much less effective in my investor meeting as a result. And so you should try to group especially external versus internal calls, because you'll find you have to kind of mentally switch gears, and context switching is just fundamentally kind of a hard thing to do well. Project management. The key to kind of successful project management as a small team is front-loading the project planning as much as you possibly can. So I can give an example of this. Say we're at Pioneer and we have this feature that we're building where as you're submitting your weekly progress update, we give you sort of a recommended article or two or some sort of advice based on the progress update that you write. So in your update, if you say, this week I'm planning to do user interviews, what you'll do is, what we'll do is recommend to that user advice on how to conduct a great user interview. So we'll write a spec, write the goal, MVP, P2s, metrics, timeline, kind of whatever is important, whatever you and your team decide on. You'll work with the designer, and then you'll start building. You'll start building, and then you'll run into a bunch of questions along the way. Well, how do we deploy the ML model we're using to generate recommendations? What sources should we use to kind of collect, to show to our users? You'll run into these questions, you'll start talking to other teammates, and you'll try to answer these along the way. And as a result, if you kind of think back to that calendar, you're going to be squeezing this all throughout the week, and you're going to slow down. So it's kind of a hard thing to practice, but what you want to do is, tempting as it may be to just jump into building the thing, break down the tasks as specifically as possible, and figure out, kind of predict what all your open questions might be along the way. And if you do this well, you'll find yourself actually just moving much more quickly. You'll be building products much faster. And the time to writing your first line of code will be much longer, but it'll be much more effective overall. And the last key to productivity is making quick decisions. I think everyone here has probably heard, oh, this team moves super fast. As investors said, wow, this team is so impressive, they move really fast. It's actually probably 20% of the fact that they maybe write code relatively quickly, but 80% of it is just decision making and a bias to action. So you shouldn't kind of think, wow, they must have amazing engineers who are writing code really quickly. They just have a culture of making quick decisions and deciding to do something instead of spending too long trying to figure out what the right and wrong decision is. So I think if there's nothing else that you kind of remember about good decision making, Des, one of the founders of Intercom, has this great quote, which is, fast gets good quicker than good gets fast. And the easiest way to reason about that is just kind of, your brain is basically an ML model. You're going to have more shots on goal. You'll have more data to train on. You'll make more wrong decisions, but eventually you'll start making the right decisions. And at the end of the year, you'll have run 100 experiments instead of 10 experiments. At Pioneer, we have what is basically the trump card in any conversation about what should we do, which is, well, why not just try it once? You're like, oh, can't really argue with that. And so we do that a lot. A lot of our responses to sort of product discussions are just run the experiment. If it's low cost with minimal downside risk and it could potentially be something huge, just do it. This is not something you can afford to do when you're at a larger company. You have to kind of be much more calculated about it. But as a small team, you can move very quickly. You can be actually quite agile. So prioritization. The best progress updates involve talking to users, building product with the goal of getting users or revenue or polishing your idea. And so as you think about kind of that relatively simple guideline, it's actually surprisingly common to find yourself in a few traps as an engineer, and that is, as a technical founder, including building too many features, perfecting features, focusing too much on technology improvements. For example, I need to update from Rails 6 to Rails 7, even though you actually don't really need to do that. And you should kind of push yourself to resist a lot of these temptations, because it's just not the best place to spend your time, typically, in the very early days when all that matters is just finding product market fit. I find a really useful exercise to run is to ask yourself, what would we do if we couldn't code? And I had actually a pretty unfortunate, I shouldn't say unfortunate, it was pretty, I discovered this the hard way, where I had this great idea for a feature, this was maybe 2.5 or 3 years ago, where we had a large number of advisors who said, hey, we want to really help the users on Pioneer. Not the people you funded, just sort of that broader community of founders. And I said, okay, great. We can build a super cool feature where all of our founders record a short video. They are going to record themselves answering a few different questions and kind of ask for some particular form of feedback. And then we're going to use some kind of hacky back-end implementation to match them with advisors that are going to be really good for them. And we'll send those links to our advisors and kind of automatically let them email one another back and forth. And my co-founder just said, all right, well, why don't we just email them a few Google Doc links? See if the advisors are willing to give the founders feedback. And I was like, all right, I mean, the advisors have been telling us they want to give feedback, so we could try. I'm pretty sure they'll give lots of feedback. We ran this experiment, and advisors basically wrote no feedback. And so I kind of went back to him, like, tail between my legs, and I was like, okay, yeah, you were right. I'm glad we didn't spend, like, 2 weeks building this feature. It's a hard way to learn that lesson. Well, it could have been a lot worse. I could have wasted 2 weeks. But it's an important one to remember. Ask yourself, much more often than you probably are, what would we do if we couldn't code? The last thing I want to highlight in terms of good decision-making and prioritization is first principles thinking. Be really careful about where and when you rely on other examples. So here's the Salesforce landing page. And landing pages are a very common example of where someone who's maybe not a designer will say, well, I don't really know how to do this. Let me go look at a successful company and kind of copy their landing page. If you have a startup and no one knows what your company does, and this is your landing page, this is a horrible landing page. Like, no one's going to know what you're doing. Here's Stripe. Now, there's much more that's good about this landing page if you're a brand new startup, but you can kind of look at this and payments infrastructure for the internet. If you're a brand new startup and no one knows what you do, you actually don't want to take the route of the big, ambitious wording. You want to do what Stripe did in the early days. You go to this landing page. This is a screenshot from, I think, 2011. Stripe makes it easy to start accepting credit cards on the web today. You go to this landing page, you instantly know what the product does. The last thing that I want to touch on is communication. Great technical founders are stellar communicators, both from a technical perspective and a non-technical perspective. They kind of build a model of who they're speaking with, and they understand how to use language accordingly. There is actually a great YouTube series that I would recommend if you haven't seen this before. It's experts explaining very complicated concepts at 5 levels of difficulty to I think it starts with like a 5-year-old, and then it ends with a fellow expert in the field, and you can see what that looks like in action. And it's really interesting. You should ask yourself when you're talking to maybe someone who's non-technical and you're trying to explain a bug that's happening, and like figure out what the right level of abstraction is that you need to explain to them. And if they pry and they want more details, then dig deeper, but maybe start with a level of abstraction that they are going to be much more comfortable with. So that's basically it. I know that's kind of a lot of sort of things to reflect on. I will say that I think most technical founders are actually A's in like a wide variety of these categories already, and just need to kind of reflect and figure out what are the areas that I want to spend more time working on. And you spend a little bit of time working on it, and you'll find that it'll have hopefully been worth it. You'll move faster, and none of this is kind of a guide on how to find product market fit. But the goal is, you'll get there faster. You'll make the right decisions, or you'll hopefully, make wrong decisions, but at least more quickly, and then you'll eventually get there. So that's it. Thanks for listening. If you're working on a company, you should definitely apply to Pioneer. If you're looking for a job, we are hiring for data science and venture. Besides that, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Rishi. And you're also giving live product feedback on the Q&A stage. So if you have a product, if you have a website, if you have anything that you want to get live critiqued, Rishi said he's like very brave to give you like his unfiltered live feedback, which hopefully is going to be fun. I know some of you submitted your ideas, so Rishi's doing that on the QA stage right now.
Yeah,
so
we're going to We just improvised. We'll just go there, and if you give me your website URL, we'll just enter it live and talk about it.
All right. Thank you so much, Rishi.
Thank you.